The florist's call came at a moment when Sienna Walsh was reviewing the documents that could completely destroy Donovan Reed's life. The phone vibrated on the pile of bank statements, compromising photographs, and printed emails she had meticulously collected over 6 months working as a housekeeper in his mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. "Miss Walsh, this is Primrose Florist. I have a delicate situation. Mr. Reed placed an order for 3 dozen red roses, but the delivery address is not the main residence. It's an apartment in Manhattan, on 5th Avenue. Sienna felt her stomach churn, not from surprise, but from a cold, calculated anger. She already knew about the apartment. She already knew about the woman who lived there, a 23-year-old model named Amber, who firmly believed that Donovan was a divorced investor. Sienna had photographs of them together in expensive restaurants, receipts for jewelry that cost more than most people earned in a year, records of bank transfers that would be especially interesting to the IRS. "I understand," Sienna said, keeping her voice steady while her mind worked quickly. "What's the message on the card?" "To my one true love. You light up every day of my life. Forever yours, D." The words were almost identical to those he had written to his legitimate wife just 2 weeks ago, on their wedding anniversary. Sienna knew because she had found the discarded card in his office trash, along with the draft where he had apparently changed "my only joy" to "one true love," before settling on the final version. "Miss Walsh, are you still there?" "Yes, sorry. How much would it cost to change the order?" "Change? I'm not sure I can do that without Mr. Reed's authorization. Double the amount, in cash, today." There was a significant pause on the other end of the line. Sienna knew that silence. It was the sound of professional ethics weighed against an unexpected financial opportunity. "What kind of change are we talking about?" "Keep the flowers, change the card, and deliver to the original address, to Mr. Reed, in his private office. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Sienna hung up before the florist could reconsider. She looked again at the documents spread out on the oak table in her real apartment, not the tiny maid's room she pretended was her home. This place, a spacious loft in Brooklyn, revealed who Sienna truly was, a lawyer specializing in marital fraud, with framed diplomas from Columbia Law School on the walls and a bookshelf full of legal codes and precedents from complicated cases. But none of that mattered as much as the photograph she kept on her desk. A woman with kind eyes and gray hair smiled from the silver frame. Margaret Reed, Donovan's first wife, the one he had abandoned 15 years ago when his tech business finally took off. Margaret, who had worked 2 jobs to pay for his college, who had mortgaged the house inherited from her parents to finance his startup, who had believed him when he said they were partners in everything. Margaret, who now lived in a modest apartment in Queens, while Donovan flaunted a fortune built on her hard work and sacrifice. Sienna had met Margaret at a community health clinic where she volunteered. The older woman was there for a routine checkup without decent health insurance, saving every penny. They started talking in the waiting room, and something in the resigned sadness in Margaret's eyes touched Sienna deeply. Over several cups of coffee at a nearby diner, the whole story emerged. Donovan hadn't just abandoned Margaret. He had systematically erased her contribution to his success. The company documents didn't mention her loans. The divorce settlement, signed when Margaret was vulnerable and desperate, gave her only a minimal fraction of what would have been fair. And worst of all, Donovan had spread rumors in his social circles that Margaret was unstable, problematic, that he had escaped from a toxic marriage. Sienna had heard variations of this story many times in her career. Powerful men rewriting the narrative, turning their victims into villains. But there was something about Margaret that made her act differently this time. Instead of simply taking the case and working within the conventional limits of the law, Sienna proposed something bolder. "Let me into his life," she had said, "as a housekeeper, as someone invisible. Let me collect the evidence that ordinary lawyers could never obtain. Let me show the world who Donovan Reed really is." Margaret had hesitated. It was risky, potentially unethical, certainly unconventional. But after years of helplessness, watching her ex-husband thrive while she struggled, the temptation to finally have justice was too strong. Now, 6 months later, Sienna had it all. Evidence of tax fraud, proof of multiple extramarital affairs during his second marriage, documents showing how Donovan had hidden assets during Margaret's divorce, completely violating the terms of the settlement. She even had audio recordings of him admitting to close friends that he had played the game during the divorce, ensuring that Margaret wouldn't get even a penny more than necessary. The florist's call was just the cherry on top, a final piece of evidence showing his pattern of behavior. But more than that, it was an opportunity Sienna couldn't waste. She grabbed her bag, checked that she had enough cash, and headed to the florist. The subway ride gave her time to compose the perfect message for the card. Something that would make Donovan immediately understand that his carefully constructed world of lies was about to crumble. Primrose Florist was a charming establishment in an upscale neighborhood with windows filled with elaborate arrangements. The owner, a middle-aged man with a nervous expression, greeted her in the back of the shop. "Did you bring the money?" he asked bluntly. Sienna placed the envelopes on the counter. He counted quickly, and she saw greed and guilt battling on his face. What will the new message be? Sienna had already written it on a piece of paper. She handed it to him and watched as he read, his eyes widening. This is going to cause serious trouble. That's exactly the point. I don't want to get involved in anything illegal. There's nothing illegal about delivering flowers with an honest message, Sienna replied calmly. Mr. Reed placed the order. I'm just exercising my right to send my own message, with my own flowers, which coincidentally are exactly the same as the ones he ordered. It was a technical distinction, but it worked. The florist reluctantly nodded and began preparing the new card in the elegant handwriting for which his shop was known. Sienna watched the words take shape. Thank you for showing me who you really are. The evidence has been sent to your divorce lawyer and the press. Signed, your wife, not housekeeper. Technically, it wasn't a complete lie. Margaret was his ex-wife, and Sienna was acting on her behalf. And as for the part about not being a housekeeper, well, that was absolutely true. When will it be delivered? Sienna asked. This afternoon, around 3 o'clock, when he's usually in private meetings at the office. Perfect. That would give Sienna enough time to ensure that all the documents were indeed in the right hands. Donovan's divorce lawyer, who represented his current second wife, had already had copies for 2 days, waiting for the right moment to strike. As for the press, Sienna had cultivated a careful relationship with an investigative journalist from the New York Times who specialized in exposing corporate fraud. Everything was lined up. Years of lies, manipulation, and cruelty were about to catch up with Donovan Reed in a way he had never anticipated. As she left the florist, Sienna allowed herself a small smile. Donovan had never really looked at her during those 6 months. To him, she was just another housekeeper, someone who cleaned his house, prepared his meals, and conveniently disappeared when not needed. He never imagined that those watchful eyes were cataloging every mistake, every slip, every moment of arrogance that revealed his true character. Invisibility had been her greatest weapon, and now it was time for Donovan Reed to discover that the people we ignore are often the ones who see everything. The digital clock on the car dashboard read 2:47 p.m. when Sienna parked 3 blocks from Donovan's office in Midtown Manhattan. Her hands were slightly sweaty against the leather steering wheel of the discreet sedan she used for her investigative work. In 13 minutes, the roses would arrive. In 13 minutes, Donovan Reed's carefully orchestrated life would begin to crumble like a house of cards in a gale. She checked her phone for the 10th time in 5 minutes. The Times journalist, Rebecca Chen, had confirmed receipt of all the digitized documents an hour ago. The response had been succinct, but laden with professional enthusiasm. This is gold. We'll publish tomorrow morning, front page of the business section. Possibly the cover, depending on the editor-in-chief. The divorce lawyer, Marcus Holloway, a meticulous man with a reputation for devouring unfaithful husbands for breakfast, had sent an even more satisfying message. "My client is ready. We'll file the papers today at 5 p.m., right after banking hours. He won't have time to move assets. You're brilliant, Walsh." But it was Margaret's message that Sienna kept rereading, the one that made her chest tighten with a mix of pride and emotion. The older woman had simply written, "I don't know how to thank you. For the first time in 15 years, I feel like I can breathe." Sienna put her phone away and closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to revisit the memory that had fueled each day of this exhaustive investigation. The morning, 3 months ago, when she had walked into Donovan's mansion kitchen and found his second wife, Vanessa, sitting alone at the table, her face swollen from crying. Vanessa Reed was everything one would expect from a trophy wife of a tech mogul. Perfectly styled blonde hair, a body maintained by expensive personal trainers, a wardrobe that cost more than most people paid in rent for a year. But that morning, without makeup and with red eyes, she simply looked human, vulnerable, broken. "I'm sorry," Vanessa had said, quickly wiping her tears when she noticed Sienna's presence. "I shouldn't be here. Has Donovan left?" "He left an hour ago, Mrs. Reed. Meeting at the office until 5. Vanessa nodded, and then, to Sienna's surprise, began to speak. Perhaps it was the loneliness, or maybe the fact that housekeepers were like walking confessionals for the rich, safe repositories of secrets because they were considered too irrelevant to matter. "I found messages on his phone," Vanessa confessed, her voice breaking. "A girl, young enough to be my daughter, not the first. It's never the first." She looked at Sienna with eyes pleading for understanding. "I know what you must be thinking, that I'm stupid for staying, that I deserve this for marrying a married man." Sienna had approached carefully, placing a cup of hot tea in front of the woman. "I'm not thinking that, Mrs. Reed." "He was married when we met," Vanessa continued, as if needing to justify her own existence. "But he told me the marriage was over for years, that it was just paperwork, that she was unstable and preventing him from being happy. I believed him. God, how foolish I was." It was at that moment that Sienna had realized something fundamental. Donovan didn't just have one victim. He collected victims, each believing they were special, each eventually discovering they were just another piece in an endless pattern of manipulation and betrayal. "Are you going to leave him?" Sienna had asked gently. Vanessa had laughed, a bitter, joyless sound. "With what money? The prenup I signed guarantees I walk away with almost nothing if the marriage lasts less than 10 years. We're in year 8. He knows exactly what he's doing. He always has." It was at that moment that Sienna made a decision that technically violated her original mission. She was supposed to be there just for Margaret, collecting specific evidence related to the original fraudulent divorce. But looking at Vanessa, seeing the reflection of Margaret's pain 15 years later, Sienna understood that this case was bigger than just one victim. "And what if I told you there's a way?" Sienna had asked carefully, weighing each word. Vanessa looked up, a spark of hope mixed with distrust. "What kind of way?" "The kind that involves a really good lawyer and very solid evidence of behavior that would nullify any prenup." It had been risky to reveal herself, even partially. But Sienna had learned to trust her instincts about people, and her instincts told her that Vanessa was desperate enough to be an ally, not an enemy. In the following months, as Sienna continued her investigative work, Vanessa became an invaluable source of information. She knew the codes to his bank accounts, the passwords to his computers, the patterns of his lies. Together, they wove a net so tight that Donovan would have nowhere to run when he finally realized he was trapped. Sienna's phone vibrated, pulling her from her memories. A message from the florist. "Delivery completed. Flowers received by Mr. Reed personally." Sienna's heart raced. She could imagine the scene. Donovan in his elegant office with a panoramic view of the city, receiving the extravagant bouquet. Perhaps he was smiling, thinking of Amber and the romantic night he had planned. Then he would open the card. Her phone rang. It was Vanessa, her voice tense with excitement and fear. "I just got a message from him. He's furious. Wants to know where I am, what I know, what I did. Sienna, I'm scared." "Are you where we agreed?" Sienna asked, keeping her voice calm and professional. "Yes, at my sister's apartment. He doesn't know this address." "Great. Keep your phone on, but don't respond to any of his messages. Marcus is already on his way with the divorce papers and a temporary restraining order. You're safe, Vanessa. I promise." There was silence on the other end. Then Vanessa said softly, "Why are you doing this for me? I know you were hired by Margaret. I read the documents you showed me, but you've gone above and beyond. Why?" Sienna looked out the car window, watching people rush by on the sidewalk, each carrying their own stories, their own hidden pains. "Because no one did this for my mother," she finally said, the words escaping before she could censor them. It was true, though it was something she rarely admitted, even to herself. Her mother had been like Margaret, like Vanessa, a woman who had loved the wrong man, who had sacrificed everything, only to be discarded when she was no longer convenient. Sienna had been 13 when her father left, taking not only his presence, but also the family's savings, the car, even the confidence her mother had in herself. She had watched her mother wither for years, working 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, never seeking justice because she believed she didn't deserve it, that somehow she had failed. When her mother died, exhausted at 52, Sienna had made a promise over her grave. She would dedicate her life to ensuring that other women wouldn't suffer in silence, that men like her father would face consequences. "I'm sorry," Vanessa said gently. "I am too. But now we can turn this pain into something productive. Are you ready for what comes next? It's going to get tough. The press, the lawyers, all of Donovan's friends choosing sides." "I'm ready." Vanessa's voice was firmer now, tempered with determination. "For the first time in years, I feel like I have some control over my own life." After hanging up, Sienna sat in the car for a few more minutes, letting the adrenaline dissipate. Her phone started vibrating continuously with updates. Marcus confirmed that Donovan had attempted frantic contact, that he was clearly panicking. Rebecca Chen sent a preview of the article, a devastating piece that exposed not only the marital fraud, but also financial irregularities in his company that could attract federal interest. But it was the photograph Rebecca attached that made Sienna smile. Someone, likely a disgruntled employee in Donovan's building, had captured an image of him in the lobby, holding the bouquet of red roses, his face contorted in shock and fury as he read the card. The photo would be perfect for the article, a visual representation of the moment the mask of respectable businessman completely fell. Sienna finally started the car and began driving, not back to Brooklyn, but toward Queens, where Margaret was waiting in her modest apartment. The older woman deserved to know personally that justice, delayed but determined, had finally arrived. As she navigated through traffic, Sienna thought about how she had gotten to this point. The months of meticulous planning, the sleepless nights reviewing documents, the days pretending to be invisible while observing everything. It had been exhausting, sometimes morally ambiguous, certainly unorthodox in terms of legal practice. But when she thought of Margaret, of Vanessa, of her own mother, and the countless other women whose stories would never be told, Sienna knew that every minute had been worth it. Margaret Reed's apartment in Astoria, Queens was on the 3rd floor of a brick building worn by time, with stairs that creaked underfoot and a hallway that smelled faintly of home-cooked food and cleaning products. It was a stark contrast to the mansion in Greenwich that Donovan inhabited, the property that Margaret had helped make possible through her silent sacrifices. Sienna climbed the stairs slowly, carrying a leather folder containing copies of all the key documents. Each step echoed in the empty hallway, and she felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just another case conclusion. It was the closure of 15 years of injustice, the validation of a woman's pain that had been silenced for too long. When Margaret opened the door, Sienna was momentarily surprised by the transformation. The woman she had met months ago, that hunched figure of resignation and sadness, had been replaced by someone who looked strangely lighter. Her shoulders were straighter, her eyes sparkled with something Sienna recognized as cautious hope. "Is it done?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly as she stepped back to let Sienna in. "It's done," Sienna confirmed, allowing herself a small smile as she entered the organized but modest apartment. The living room was small, decorated with furniture that clearly had decades of age, but was kept with meticulous care. Photographs covered an entire wall, most showing a younger Margaret with a Donovan who had not yet learned to use his superficial charm as a weapon. Margaret followed Sienna's gaze to the photographs and let out a long sigh. "I know I should take them down. My therapist says it's part of moving on. But sometimes I need to look at them and remember that I didn't make it all up. That there was a time when he really loved me, or at least I believed he did." Sienna turned to face her directly. "Margaret, you don't need to justify yourself. Not to me, not to anyone. What you felt was real, even if he chose to destroy it." The two women sat on the worn sofa, and Sienna opened the folder, organizing the documents into neat piles on the coffee table. She began to explain each category of evidence, watching as Margaret processed the magnitude of what they had achieved. There were bank documents showing illegal transfers during the original divorce, emails where Donovan instructed his lawyers to hide assets, even records of conversations where he mocked Margaret's naivety. "He said this?" Margaret whispered, reading a particularly cruel excerpt where Donovan had boasted to a friend that his ex-wife was too dumb to hire a competent lawyer. Her hands trembled holding the paper, and Sienna saw tears welling in the corners of her eyes. "Margaret," Sienna said gently, placing her hand over the older woman's, "I know it hurts to see these words, but they are also your liberation. They prove that he consciously manipulated the divorce process, that he lied under oath, that he committed deliberate fraud. Marcus Holloway believes we can reopen your case based on this evidence. You could get what was rightfully yours from the start." Margaret nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "It's not even about the money," she murmured. "I mean, yes, the money would help immensely, but it's more about validation, about proving that I wasn't crazy, that I didn't imagine his cruelty, that my contribution to his success meant something." "It meant everything," Sienna asserted firmly, "and now the whole world is going to know it." She took her phone and showed Margaret the preview of the Times article. The headline was devastating. "Tech mogul Donovan Reed accused of marital and financial fraud. Decades-long pattern of manipulation exposed." The article detailed not only Margaret's case but also Vanessa's accusations and the evidence of multiple infidelities and financial misconduct. Margaret read in silence, her expression going through a series of emotions: shock, sadness, and finally something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "He's going to lose everything," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Not everything," Sienna corrected, "but enough to hurt. Enough for him to understand that actions have consequences, even when you're rich and powerful." Sienna's phone vibrated again in her pocket. She picked it up and saw a message from Marcus Holloway, each one more urgent than the last. The last simply read, "Call me, now." With an apologetic look to Margaret, Sienna dialed the lawyer's number. He answered on the first ring, his normally composed voice now tinged with excitement. "Sienna, you won't believe it. Donovan just showed up at my office." "What?" Sienna stood up abruptly, her heart racing. "When?" 10 minutes ago. He's in my lobby now, demanding to speak with me. He's completely out of control, shouting about suing everyone, about how you invaded his privacy, about how this is all a conspiracy. I have security ready in case he gets violent, but I thought you should know." Sienna processed the information quickly, her legal brain automatically shifting into crisis mode. "Is he recording everything?" "Every second. My office has security cameras at every angle." "Perfect. Don't let him into your private office." Keep everything in the public space where recordings are legal without bilateral consent. And Marcus, whatever he says, don't respond with specific details of the case. Just inform him that the documents will be presented through the appropriate channels. Understood, but Sienna, he's really out of control. He mentioned your name specifically, said you tricked him. That you infiltrated his home under false pretenses. He's threatening to file criminal charges. Sienna felt a knot form in her stomach, but kept her voice steady. Let him threaten. Every word he says now is being documented and can be used as evidence of guilty conscience. Innocent people don't have public meltdowns. After hanging up, Sienna turned to find Margaret watching her with a concerned expression. Could you get in trouble for this? The older woman asked. For infiltrating as a housekeeper? It was a fair question, and Sienna had spent months consulting other lawyers and ethics experts to ensure she was on legally defensible ground. There is a risk, she admitted honestly. What I did is in the gray area. I didn't violate any specific laws. I obtained employment through conventional means. I didn't install listening devices or hack password-protected computers. But Donovan and his lawyers will try to paint this as something sinister. You shouldn't have risked so much, Margaret said, her voice breaking. Not for me. It wasn't just for you, Sienna replied, sitting down next to the woman. It was for all the Margarets in the world, for my own mother, for Vanessa, for every woman who was manipulated by men who think power and money put them above consequences. Margaret took Sienna's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength for someone so fragile in appearance. Then let's make sure it was worth it. Let's take this all the way, no matter what he tries to do. The determination in Margaret's voice was palpable, a complete transformation from the resigned woman Sienna had first met. This was what she fought to achieve in every case, this moment when the victim became a survivor, when shame turned into strength. The digital clock on Sienna's dashboard read 3:01 p.m. as she pulled into the parking lot of Marcus Holloway's office building. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The next few hours would be crucial, not just for Margaret, but for all the women who had been silenced by men like Donovan Reed. As she stepped out of the car, Sienna felt a surge of adrenaline. She was ready. Ready to fight, ready to expose the truth, and ready to ensure that justice would finally be served. Sienna felt a wave of tension course down her spine. She had anticipated resistance. She knew Donovan wouldn't accept her exposure passively, but direct threats elevated the situation to a new level of danger. I'm 20 minutes away. Don't let anyone else see that recording until I arrive. The drive to Midtown Manhattan was a blur of lights and reflections. Sienna drove on autopilot, her mind processing scenarios and countermeasures. She had built her career by being meticulous, anticipating every possible move. But there was something about Donovan Reed's volatility that made her uneasy. Men accustomed to having total control over their lives often reacted in unpredictable ways when that control was ripped from them. Marcus Holloway's office occupied 3 floors of a glass and steel skyscraper, the kind of space that whispered power and unlimited resources. The night receptionist, a middle-aged woman with an efficient expression, recognized her immediately and led her to the private elevator that went directly to Marcus's conference room. The lawyer was waiting for her along with 2 members of his team. A young associate named Carmen Rodriguez and a security specialist Sienna had met in previous cases, a former police officer named Raymond Foster. The atmosphere in the room was tense, every face showing variations of the same concern. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Marcus said, gesturing to a chair in front of a large screen where the security video was paused. "I need to warn you. What you're about to see is disturbing." Donovan was clearly out of his mind. Sienna nodded, and Marcus pressed play. The image showed the office lobby, filmed from an elevated angle. Donovan Reed was in the center of the frame, having just been escorted to the exit by security. He deliberately turned to the camera, as if he knew exactly where it was positioned, and began to speak. "Sienna Walsh." His voice was cold, controlled in a way that was more threatening than any shout. "Do you think you're smart? That you can infiltrate my life, steal my privacy, and walk away unscathed? I know people. I have resources you can't even imagine. I will destroy your career, your reputation, everything you've built. And as for pathetic Margaret, she will regret ever thinking she could challenge me. You both will find out what happens when someone crosses Donovan Reed." The image froze with Donovan's face contorted in pure rage. Sienna felt her stomach churn, not from fear, but from anger. She had dedicated months to exposing his cruelty, and here he was, proving once again that he was exactly the kind of man she had always known he was. "This is admissible as character evidence," Carmen said immediately, her pen already scribbling notes on a legal pad. "It demonstrates a pattern of threatening behavior and witness intimidation." Raymond leaned forward, fingers interlaced on the table. "It's more than that. Some of those statements could be interpreted as direct threats. I can file a police report tonight. Get a temporary restraining order until this is properly processed." Sienna shook her head slowly, processing the options. Part of her wanted to react immediately, to use every legal tool available to protect herself and Margaret. But another part, the strategist who had orchestrated this entire exposure, recognized an opportunity. "Not yet," she finally said. "Let him think he's in control, that his threats have intimidated us. The more confident he becomes, the more mistakes he will make." Marcus frowned. "Sienna, I understand your logic, but I can't in good conscience allow you to put yourself at risk. This man clearly has resources and is willing to use them." "Exactly why we need to be smarter than he is," Sienna argued. "Raymond, can you arrange discreet security for me and Margaret? Something Donovan won't immediately notice?" The former police officer nodded. "I have a team that handles this kind of situation. 24-hour surveillance, agent rotation, everything documented for legal record. He won't get close to either of you without us knowing." "Perfect. Marcus, I want you to proceed with Vanessa's divorce papers as planned. Don't let his threats change our timeline. In fact, this recording strengthens her case that he is emotionally abusive and potentially dangerous." Carmen raised her hand timidly. "What about the Times article? Is it still going to be published tomorrow morning?" Sienna picked up her phone and checked her messages. Rebecca Chen had sent an update 15 minutes ago. "Article approved for publication. Front page of the business section, with photo. It will be published online at 6 a.m., printed at 7. Ready for the fallout?" "It will be published," Sienna confirmed. "And when it is, Donovan will realize that empty threats don't change documented facts. The world will see who he really is, no matter how much money he has or how many people he knows." The meeting continued for another hour, each team member contributing their expertise to build a comprehensive strategy for protection and response. By the time they finally finished, it was past midnight, and Sienna felt the weight of an exhausting day pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. Raymond accompanied her to the parking lot, where 2 of his agents were already positioned in a discreet vehicle. "They will follow you home, establish a perimeter," he explained. "Tomorrow morning, when the article is published, we'll have full coverage for both you and Margaret. He won't get close to either of you." Sienna thanked him and got into her car. Driving through the illuminated streets of Manhattan, with the constant awareness of the security vehicle maintaining a professional distance behind her. It felt strange to be the protected instead of the protector, to be vulnerable instead of in control. But she also recognized the necessity, understood that she had underestimated how viscerally Donovan would react to having his world exposed. When she arrived at her loft in Brooklyn, Sienna found a message from Vanessa waiting. Donovan's second wife had sent a long audio message, her voice alternating between fear and determination. "Sienna, I saw the news. Some mutual friends are already calling, saying Donovan is furious, that he's making threats. I'm scared, but I'm also relieved. Because finally, other people are seeing what I always knew he was. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for giving me the courage to leave." Sienna saved the audio carefully. It was another piece of evidence, another voice joining the chorus of women Donovan had hurt. She prepared a chamomile tea and sat on her apartment balcony, looking out at the city lights while processing everything that had happened. Her phone showed 2:47 a.m. when she finally allowed herself to check emails one last time. There was a message from an unknown address, no subject. Sienna hesitated before opening it, her lawyer instincts alerting her to possible dangerous content. But curiosity won. The message was short, just 3 lines. You don't know who you're messing with. There's still time to back down, to make this disappear. Think carefully about your next actions. There was no signature, but Sienna didn't need one to know who had sent it. The tone, the underlying arrogance, the assumption that she could be intimidated so easily. It was pure Donovan Reed. She read the message 3 times, then did something that surprised even herself. She forwarded the email to Rebecca Chen, to Marcus Holloway, to Raymond Foster, and to the New York City Cyber Crimes Department. If Donovan wanted to play the intimidation game, she would ensure that every move he made was documented, catalogued, and eventually used against him. Then, with the first rays of light beginning to brighten the horizon, Sienna replied to the message with just 4 words: publication in 3 hours. She pressed send and turned off her phone, finally allowing herself to relax on the sofa. Donovan Reed's world was about to crumble publicly, and no amount of threats or money could stop what she had set in motion. Dawn in Manhattan arrived with an intensity Sienna hadn't experienced in months. At 6 a.m., exactly as Rebecca Chen had promised, the article went live on the New York Times website. Sienna was awake, sitting at her work desk with a cup of coffee already cooling between her hands, watching the view counter rise exponentially with each passing minute. The headline remained firm on the main page: Tech mogul Donovan Reed accused of matrimonial and financial fraud, decades-long pattern of manipulation exposed. The photograph of Donovan holding the red roses, his face contorted in fury, dominated the visual space. It was an image that told 1,000 stories, each one about a man whose carefully constructed mask had finally shattered. Her phone began to vibrate incessantly. First came messages from fellow lawyers, congratulating her on the investigative work. Then came calls from the media. Reporters wanting exclusive interviews, morning show commentators requesting her presence. Sienna ignored them all, keeping her focus on the only thing that mattered, ensuring that Margaret and Vanessa were protected from the tsunami of attention that was about to fall upon them. Margaret called at 7:15, her voice trembling not from fear, but from something that sounded suspiciously like disbelieving joy. "Sienna, are you seeing this? Are you seeing how many people are sharing the article? My friends are calling me, people I haven't spoken to in years, saying they always knew something was wrong with Donovan, that they always believed me." Sienna felt her chest tighten with emotion. "How are you feeling, Margaret? Really?" There was a long pause on the other end, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice carried a different weight, deeper. "I feel like I can finally breathe. Like a giant stone I've been carrying for 15 years has been lifted from my chest. I'm still scared about what comes next, but for the first time in a long time, I'm also hopeful." After hanging up with Margaret, Sienna checked her messages from Vanessa. Donovan's current wife had sent a series of screenshots of emails and text messages he had sent throughout the night, each one more desperate and manipulative than the last. In some, he tried to convince her that it was all a misunderstanding, that the evidence was fabricated. In others, he threatened, promising to make her life miserable if she proceeded with the divorce. Vanessa's last message simply read, "Marcus is with me now. We're filing the papers in an hour. I'm ready to end this." Raymond Foster appeared at Sienna's apartment at 8 a.m., accompanied by a security agent named Diana Cortez, a compact, muscular woman with eyes that missed nothing. "The situation changed overnight," Raymond announced without preamble. Donovan hired a private investigation firm, one of the big ones, specializing in discrediting witnesses and finding dirt on legal adversaries. Sienna felt a chill run down her spine, but kept her voice steady. What did they find? Diana turned the laptop screen toward her, showing a document Sienna recognized immediately. It was her mother's death report, but it also included details about the circumstances leading to her death, the chronic exhaustion, the untreated depression, the multiple jobs that had broken her body and spirit. And crucially, it mentioned Sienna's father, the man who had abandoned the family. "They're going to try to use this," Diana said gently. "They're going to argue that you have personal bias, that this case was never about justice for Margaret, but about resolving your own unresolved issues with your father." Sienna read the document in silence, feeling old memories resurface. She remembered her mother's funeral, standing alone by the grave because her father hadn't bothered to show up. She remembered making the vow there, dedicating her life to ensuring that other women didn't suffer as her mother had suffered. "And they're not wrong," she finally said, her voice calm but firm. "I do have personal bias. This work is personal to me. But that doesn't make the evidence any less valid, doesn't change that Donovan Reed committed fraud, lied under oath, systematically destroyed lives for his own benefit." There was a long silence. Then Raymond said something that surprised Sienna. "In fact, it could even strengthen your case. It shows that you have genuine empathy for victims, that you understand their pain not just intellectually, but emotionally. The public jury might respond well to that if it's presented correctly." Sienna considered his words carefully. She had always kept her personal story private, separate from her professional work. The idea of exposing it publicly, of turning her mother's pain into a public narrative, felt like a betrayal to her memory. But perhaps, just perhaps, sharing that truth could help others understand why this work mattered so much. "I want to talk to Rebecca," Sienna decided. "If they're going to use my mother's story to discredit me, then I'm going to tell that story on my own terms. I'm going to show exactly why I dedicated my career to this work." Diana nodded approvingly as Sienna dialed Rebecca's number. The journalist answered immediately, her voice buzzing with professional excitement. "Sienna, I was just about to call. Donovan's lawyers just released a statement attacking you. They're claiming you're an activist with a personal agenda against successful men." "I know," Sienna replied calmly. "And I want to do an interview, on the record, telling my own story, explaining why I do this work. Are you interested?" There was a brief pause. Then Rebecca said, "Absolutely. When?" "Today, now, before their narrative gains more traction." 3 hours later, Sienna was sitting in front of the camera in an improvised studio that the Times team had quickly set up. Rebecca was on the other side, with a professional but warm expression, ready to conduct the interview that would be published simultaneously in video and text. "Sienna Walsh," Rebecca began as the cameras started rolling. "You spent months infiltrating Donovan Reed's home as a housekeeper to collect evidence against him. Some critics are calling your methods unethical. What do you say to them?" Sienna took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "I say that ethics are complicated when you're dealing with someone who uses the legal system as a weapon against vulnerable victims. Donovan Reed had resources, expensive lawyers, powerful connections. His victims had trauma, fear, and a system that historically doesn't believe them. I leveled the playing field." "But you deceived your way into his life," Rebecca pressed, playing devil's advocate. "You pretended to be someone you weren't." "I was exactly who I said I was," Sienna corrected gently. "A woman looking for a job as a housekeeper. I just happened to also be a lawyer specializing in matrimonial fraud. Those identities aren't mutually exclusive, and everything I observed, everything I documented, was accessible to anyone in that position." Rebecca nodded, then shifted direction. "Donovan's lawyers discovered that your own mother suffered through a difficult divorce, that she worked herself to exhaustion after your father abandoned the family. They're suggesting that your motivation in this case was personal revenge disguised as justice. Is that true?" Sienna felt tears threatening, but she kept them under control. This was the important part, the moment of calculated vulnerability that could change the entire narrative. "My mother died when I was 22. She worked 3 jobs trying to support us after my father left. She never sought justice, never fought for what she deserved, because the system made her believe she had no rights, that she should be grateful for the little she received. She paused, letting the words settle. So, yes, this work is personal. Every case I take is personal, because I see my mother in every woman like Margaret, in every Vanessa who walks into my office believing she has no power. But my personal motivation doesn't change the facts. It doesn't change that Donovan Reed committed fraud, that he lied under oath, that he systematically destroyed lives for his own benefit. Rebecca leaned forward. What would you say to other women who are in situations similar to those of Margaret or Vanessa? Women who feel trapped, powerless. Sienna looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to Rebecca, but to everyone who would watch. I would say that your silence only protects those who hurt you. Your voice, your story, your testimony has power. It can be scary to speak out. It can feel impossible to challenge someone with more money or influence. But you are not alone. There are people who believe you, who will fight alongside you, who understand that justice sometimes requires extraordinary courage. The interview continued for another 40 minutes, covering details of the case, Sienna's investigative methods, and the broader legal implications. When it finally ended, Sienna felt strangely empty yet also relieved. She had exposed her own vulnerability, transforming her personal pain into public narrative, but in a way that maintained control and dignity. Rebecca turned off the cameras and approached, offering a hug that Sienna gratefully accepted. It was powerful, the journalist said softly. Authentic. People are going to respond to this. When Sienna returned to the apartment, it was already getting dark. Raymond and Diana had gone out to organize the security team's shift change, leaving her alone with her thoughts for the first time in hours. She made tea and sat on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Her phone showed accumulated messages, Marcus reporting progress on Vanessa's case, Margaret sending photographs of flowers that neighbors had left at her door with notes of support, several unknown women thanking her for giving voice to their experiences. But it was the message from an unknown address that caught her attention. It was short, just 2 lines. I watched your interview, you are right. Some battles are worth fighting no matter the personal cost. Thank you for fighting this one. There was no signature, but Sienna suspected she knew who had sent it. Someone who understood, who had gone through something similar, who recognized the weight of turning personal trauma into meaningful action. She saved the message and looked out at the horizon, at the vastness of Manhattan illuminated against the night sky. Somewhere out there, Donovan Reed was facing the consequences of decades of cruelty. Somewhere, Margaret was breathing easier for the first time in years. Somewhere, Vanessa was building courage for her next chapter. And somewhere, Sienna Walsh was learning that justice was not just about legal victories or public exposés. It was about restoring the dignity of those who had been stripped of it, about empowering the powerless, about transforming silence into testimony. 3 weeks after the Times article was published, the landscape had changed dramatically. Sienna was in the federal courthouse in Manhattan, sitting in the gallery as she watched the proceedings she had set in motion. The SEC's case against Donovan Reed had advanced with surprising speed, fueled by the overwhelming amount of evidence she had meticulously gathered during her months as an employee. The man sitting at the defense table looked little like the arrogant mogul she had watched for so long. Donovan was visibly thinner, his shoulders hunched under the weight of multiple legal battles. His lawyer, one of the most expensive in New York, was arguing vehemently for a settlement, trying to minimize the damages that were already monumental. Margaret was sitting next to Sienna, her hands nervously intertwined in her lap. The older woman had visibly transformed in the past few weeks, not just in appearance, but in something more fundamental. There was a posture in her shoulders that hadn't existed before, a light in her eyes that suggested healing, even if slow and incomplete. I never thought I'd see this day, Margaret whispered, as the judge reviewed the documents before him. 15 years imagining what it would be like if he finally faced consequences. Now that it's happening, I feel something strange. What kind of strange? Sienna asked gently, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb the proceedings. Margaret hesitated, searching for the right words. It's not satisfaction exactly. It's more like relief, like a giant weight I've been carrying is finally being acknowledged by others, like my pain has finally been validated. Sienna squeezed her hand, understanding perfectly. She had seen this transformation in victims before, the moment they realized that believing in themselves was as important as making others believe them. The legal process was necessary, but true healing came from within. The judge began to speak, his deep voice echoing through the courtroom. He outlined the terms of the proposed settlement, including substantial fines, restitution to the victims, and a ban on Donovan holding executive positions in public companies for 10 years. It wasn't prison. It wasn't the maximum punishment some had hoped for, but it was significant. When the gavel fell, finalizing the settlement, Sienna felt Margaret tremble beside her. The older woman covered her face with her hands, and Sienna realized she was crying, not out of sadness, but of release. 15 years of injustice had not been erased, but they had been recognized, validated, rectified within the limits of what the legal system could offer. Across the courtroom, Sienna watched as Vanessa left with Marcus Holloway. Donovan's second wife had finalized her divorce a week ago, emerging with a fair settlement that included substantial compensation and the freedom to rebuild her life. Vanessa caught Sienna's gaze across the crowded room and waved, a small expression of gratitude that communicated more than words could. After the proceedings, Sienna and Margaret exited the federal courthouse into the bright spring afternoon light. The city was alive with energy, people rushing by in all directions, each absorbed in their own private dramas. Amid the urban chaos, the two women stood still for a moment, letting the reality of what they had achieved sink in. "What are you going to do now?" Sienna asked as they walked slowly toward the subway. Margaret smiled, an expression that transformed her face completely. "I'm going back to school. I've always wanted to get a master's in literature, but I never had the time or money. Now I have both. And you?" "I have 3 new cases waiting," Sienna admitted. Women who read about Donovan's case and found the courage to seek help. Each story is different, but the patterns are sadly similar. Margaret stopped, turning to face Sienna directly. "Promise me one thing. Don't let this work consume you completely. I know it's important. I know you're making a difference. But you also need to take care of yourself." Sienna felt emotion tighten her throat. No one had told her that, not since her mother died. The idea that she deserved care, that her well-being mattered as much as the causes she fought for, was strangely moving. "I'll try," she promised, and she meant it. They hugged there on the sidewalk, 2 women connected by extraordinary circumstances, both transformed by the journey they had shared. When they finally pulled apart, there were tears in both their eyes, but also genuine smiles that spoke of hope and new beginnings. Sienna watched Margaret descend the subway stairs, her figure disappearing into the crowd. Then she turned in the opposite direction, walking not home, but to the small cemetery in Queens where her mother was buried. It was something she had avoided doing for years, finding it too difficult to confront the painful memories associated with that place. But today, for the first time, she felt she had something to share that might have made her mother smile. The cemetery was quiet, shaded by ancient trees that offered refuge from the afternoon heat. Sienna easily found the modest gravestone, having memorized its location even after so many years of absence. She knelt in the grass, tracing her fingers over the engraved letters that formed her mother's name. "I finally did it, Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't save you, but I saved others. Margaret, Vanessa, and so many more who will still seek help. I turned your pain into something that matters, into something that makes a difference." There was no answer, of course. Just the whisper of the wind through the leaves and the distant sound of city traffic. But Sienna felt something release within her, a knot of pain and guilt she had carried for years finally beginning to unravel. She couldn't change the past, couldn't bring her mother back or erase the suffering she had endured. But she could honor her memory by dedicating herself to ensuring that other women didn't suffer in silence. When she finally stood up, Sienna felt lighter than she had in years. She walked back through the cemetery, passing rows of gravestones marking lives lived and lost, each representing stories she would never know. How many of these stories, she wondered, involved silent injustices, unrecognized pains, victims who never had their voices heard. Her phone vibrated with a message from Raymond Foster. The security expert was updating her on the threats against her, which had significantly decreased since Donovan accepted the settlement. There were still a few hostile online commentators, people who viewed her methods as unethical regardless of the outcomes. But most public attention had shifted to other stories, other scandals. Sienna replied briefly, thanking him for keeping watch even as the danger lessened. Then she put her phone away and simply walked, letting her feet guide her without a specific destination in mind. She passed through neighborhoods that changed character with each block. From quiet residential areas to bustling commercial districts, observing the life of the city unfold around her. On a corner, she saw a young woman sitting on a park bench, red-eyed from crying, phone clutched in her hands like a lifeline. Sienna recognized that expression, that posture of someone in crisis, trying to decide between staying trapped in an impossible situation or finding the courage to escape. For a moment, she considered approaching, offering help, giving her professional card. But then she decided against it. Sometimes, healing needed to come in a person's own time. It couldn't be forced or rushed by well-meaning strangers. Instead, Sienna simply sent a silent energy of hope toward the woman, wishing for her to find her own strength, her own path to freedom. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Sienna finally returned to her loft in Brooklyn. The space that had served as a command center during the Donovan Reed investigation now felt strangely empty, devoid of the frenetic energy that had filled it for months. Documents had been filed away, evidence transferred to the appropriate authorities, surveillance equipment returned to its owners. What remained was simply her space, her personal sanctuary, waiting to be filled with the next chapter of her life. Sienna made tea and sat on her favorite balcony, watching the city lights gradually illuminate as night fell. Her laptop was open beside her, the cursor blinking on a blank document. She had agreed to write an article for a legal magazine about ethics in private investigation, using the Donovan Reed case as a case study. It was an opportunity to publicly defend her methods, to argue that sometimes justice required creativity and courage beyond the conventional limits of legal practice. But as she looked at the blank page, Sienna realized she didn't want to write about legal ethics or case precedents. She wanted to write about Margaret finding her voice after 15 years of silence, about Vanessa discovering she was worth more than the role of trophy wife, about her own mother and the countless other women whose stories would never be told. She wanted to write about the human cost of injustice and the transformative power of finally being believed, heard, and validated. Because in the end, it wasn't the legal victories or newspaper headlines that mattered most. It was the moment when a woman realized her pain wasn't her fault, that she deserved dignity and respect, that she had power over her own narrative. Sienna began to type, the words flowing more easily than she had expected. She wrote about the intersection of personal and legal justice, about how the system often failed those who needed protection the most. She wrote about transforming trauma into action, about using privilege and education to amplify voices that had been silenced. And as she wrote, with the city spread out below her and the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Sienna Walsh felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of resolved problems or completed missions, but the deeper peace of knowing she was living according to her values, honoring her mother's memory through meaningful actions. The phone rang one last time before she allowed herself to completely disconnect for the night. It was a message from Margaret, containing just a photograph. The image showed the older woman in a university bookstore, surrounded by stacks of books, smiling wider than Sienna had ever seen her. The caption simply read, "First day as a graduate student. Thank you for helping me find my way back to life." Sienna saved the photo, adding it to a growing folder of moments that reminded her why she did this work. Then she finally closed her laptop, letting the tea cool forgotten beside her, and simply existed in the present moment. A lawyer who had risked everything for justice, a daughter honoring her mother's memory. A woman learning that sometimes the greatest strength comes from acknowledging vulnerability. And somewhere in the city, other stories were unfolding, other women were finding courage, other voices were beginning to speak. Sienna couldn't save them all, couldn't fix every injustice, but she had proven that one determined person, armed with compassion and persistence, could make a difference. Sometimes, Sienna thought, as the city lights twinkled like earthly stars, that was enough.